Today we'll talk a little bit about the new year and what it means and what it's meant to a lot of people. And we'll talk more about what kind of a year it was in 2009, talk about what kind of a decade it was, and what does it mean for us as Christians trying to follow the right way. So I hope it'll spur some thoughts in your mind and some questions. I'm surprised every day that something new comes up and I haven't thought about it before. But I think, again, as I said last time, we're students of prophecy, not prophets, and we have to try to put these things in perspective. And that's really what I want to do today. On this first slide, you see a number of people that certainly made the news in 2009, from the first African-American president ever elected here, the financial crisis with Ben Bernanke, the people that on 9/11 in a decade ago that walked on in Seattle and other places. Also we have the infamous Saddam Hussein, who ended his life in the decade, and then last year's miraculous savings of a number of passengers in the Hudson River. So it really was a significant year. Now, if you were a reporter or you were someone saying rank all the things that happened in 2009, let's take a look at how you would do that. It was the end of what I would call a really significant decade. Number one, undoubtedly, in everyone's mind, at least in the U.S. and elsewhere, was the economic crisis. It was the worst recession we've seen since the end of World War II. Think about that. 7 decades we had of basic prosperity. In 2009 ended what started 18 months of a real difficult period of time. So I think we'd probably all be in agreement that that was probably the number one event. If you'd ask someone on the street what happened and what were they would say that was the worst thing. Number two, Afghanistan. 8 years now we've been battling in Afghanistan, and we really aren't any better off than we were before. You see governments attempting to make themselves known. We saw that again yesterday, elections, difficult elections, but here we are in a quagmire, and now for the first time we're seeing some real comparisons to Vietnam and the time that we spent there. So Afghanistan, again, has to be the number two story of 2009, what I've titled 8 years, and we're no better off there. Number three, Iran. Iran was an interesting story in 2009. I think no one expected perhaps it to come out maybe as good as it did when we had that. This was a real big event, and the election that took place afterwards, even though it was a political quagmire, I think people felt at least there was some surprise that it turned out as good as it did. But Iran is still going to be a thorn in the side, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Number four, if you're here in the U.S., was healthcare reform. As you know, most of 2009, Congress here spent discussing all the different issues around healthcare, and ended up with probably what won't be a surviving piece of legislation, but will start something. But you can be sure it's costing us a lot of money. $848 billion is the cost, but likely to be over $1 trillion before it's all done. So a significant piece of legislation that really adds significantly more to our financial crisis in the years to come. Number five, the massacre at Fort Hood. Massacre at Fort Hood was notable because it introduced a new element of terrorism. It's very easy to know when someone's attacking you with planes running into a tower, or someone's trying to blow a bomb up on a plane and they're from some foreign country. But to have one of your own massacre your own soldiers on your own territory, it does introduce a whole new element to this face of terrorism. Remember last time one of the things we talked about was the fact that terrorism was part of the method I believe is being used to tear down the elements of Christendom. And now we're seeing this first time things being attacked from within. a real challenging situation for those that are in charge of security. Now, I expect if I could see all your faces, you might be smiling when I show you this slide. Michael Jackson dies. That was a tragic thing for a lot of people, and I guess it gives you an idea of what people feel is important. He certainly was a renowned character, and I knew many brethren that died in 2009. For me, that impacted me much more than Michael Jackson's death. But it does show you that the world is looking for heroes. They're looking for people that will be able to take them out of the kind of world that they're living in and give them some joy and happiness. And that's why I think as we think about the kingdom and what that will bring, it will truly be one where people will feel restored. Number 7, Pakistan. You know, I was in a convention when we talked about Israel, and at the end of that we had a question and answer session, and someone asked the question, what did we think about Pakistan? This was last March. And now we can see Pakistan has turned into a very, very difficult situation. This may be the single biggest threat we have right now to the future security of us here in the United States. Pakistan is on the verge of a breakdown, bordering on anarchy. And it's a very dangerous one because, as we'll see, they have access to weapons of mass destruction, and that could be a real difficult situation. So Pakistan is one that we have to be concerned about for the future. Number 8, the Mexican drug wars. This is a real difficult situation. I'm not far from it here. We're in Phoenix for the winter time, and we see the border patrol and the border difficulties all the time. But think about this, 1,800 murders in the first 9 months of 2009. If we go back several years, 2006, 14,000 people killed in these wars over drugs. You can see why this is an enemy that's within, and it's a very challenging situation for us to be fighting a war on terrorism outside and to try to keep this drug problem from invading us in this country. So again, a very significant event in 2009. Number 9, the H1N1 virus. Now, you notice I don't call it the swine flu virus because I have a good friend that worked for one of the pork producing companies, and he always was upset when we would call it the swine flu because it really has nothing to do with swine. But the H1N1 virus, certainly it was a challenging one. The World Health Organization estimated there would be 3 billion people infected. It hasn't come nearly as much as that. But it certainly caused a great dilemma because people, again, wondered, are we subject to a pandemic? All the talk about travel here and there. Remember last time I talked about people's willingness to be restricted from their civil liberties in order to protect themselves from the health. And that's a significant thing because we could certainly see some of that in the future. So even though the H1N1 virus didn't turn into the kind of killer that people thought it would, it was still a very serious problem that a lot of people dealt with. And number 10, here's one that got lost amidst all the other troubles. Sri Lanka ended a 26-year civil war. Now I think about our civil war in the U.S. being 4 years, a few more than that, Afghanistan being a little more, but think about that, 26 years of war within your country, 70,000 dead. Finally it ended. So it was for them a happy occasion, and certainly one that would warrant being included in one of the top 10 stories of 2009. Time magazine summarized the year this way. If you look at this as the cover that was on Time at the end of the year, it says Time, the decade from hell. And it was the worst decade, certainly a lousy year as we talked about, but nothing for some people was worse than the whole decade. Ronald Reagan, when he was president or when he was running for president, asked the question, are you better off today than you were a year ago? And most people then could answer yes. For the decade, the answer for most people is really no. And I'll show you why that's true. Here's some, if you think about 10 years of activity, in the 2000s, if we go from 2000 to 2009, I really judge that as a decade. Okay, we're in the start of a new decade in 2010. So that decade of 2000 to 2009, the median household declined by 2,000, median household income. Now remember, the median represents the midpoint. So if you stacked up all the houses in the United States and the prices of all those houses, and you took the one right in the middle, that's the median. And the median household, the income from 2000 to 2009, and that household declined by $2,000. Second, the number of Americans living below the poverty line increased by 2 percentage points. So again, as we try to improve, that decade was lost for a lot of people. In fact, even more people moved below the poverty line. Number 3, the median price of an existing home, again, that middle price of an existing home, down $60,000 from the peak. Now it's actually more than what it was at the beginning of the 2000s, but less than it was from its peak. So again, most people saw a decline in the value of their living. Number 4, we had an unprecedented number of corporate bankruptcies, old line companies that you would thought would never have had an issue. Kmart, United Airlines, Circuit City, Lehman Brothers, probably the most famous one in the financial crisis. But think again, General Motors and Chrysler, for the second time we had a bankruptcy. So the auto companies changed significantly, and I'll talk a little more about that later because I think there were some significant things that happened with the auto industry. Number 5, the price of oil tripled. We think about prices going up and where they are today, and they were as much as close to, we hit that $100 barrel mark, but $70 is still triple what it was at the beginning of 2000. So I think we're in a permanently higher cost of oil, and that's really what's fueling a lot of the wealth of much of the Middle East countries. That is still a significant impact as we go forward. Number 6, sadly, as we think we're conquering crime, we find that we haven't gone as far as we should have. There were more mass shootings and school shootings than in any past decade. So a lot of people acting out their difficulties and challenges of life by taking a lot of lives, including their own. And number 7, related to that, we had more large-scale terrorist bombings and attacks than at any time in the past. So the 2000s were really a challenging time for most Americans and even people around the world, although some of the world actually made some great advances during that time, but the fact that we had a lot of issues pop up impacted a significant amount of people. So we asked the question, what went wrong? Why didn't we continue this level of prosperity? Everyone thought everything was going fine, and suddenly it was like a slap in the face. What went wrong? I think we can isolate some reasons that are significant as we look at it from the standpoint of being students of the Bible. First of all was neglect. Our culture today, and whether it's a culture here, whether it's a culture in Canada, in Europe, our culture has become increasingly what I would call inward looking. We've had a great influx here in this country of immigrants. We've had immigrants coming from all over the world. And we've ignored, by and large, the changes that come to culture with that. The growth of Islam around the world has been largely ignored. A lot of people have pointed it out for years, but suddenly we're faced with this whole area that we really know nothing about. The culture really has become protective and inward looking. And I think we have lawmakers that have been just incapable of getting beyond their own interests and rising to accommodate the common good, which is really some of the basic principles of which the early lawmakers felt were important. This was from Henry Kissinger's book on years of renewal. And Kissinger, in his dissertation on this, said the great statesmen of the past saw themselves as heroes who took on the burden of their society's painful journey from the familiar to the as yet unknown. The modern politician is less interested in being a hero than a superstar. Heroes walk alone. Stars derive their status from approbation. Heroes are defined by inner values, stars by consensus. When a candidate's views are forged in focus groups and ratified by television anchor persons, insecurity and superficiality become congenital. I just think that's a great statement of where we are today in the world's politics. Politicians have become really superheroes in a way, celebrities just like sports heroes and others, rather than really being dedicated to the common good. Think about the men like Washington or Lincoln, who Brother Russell mentioned volume 4 as he thought were being raised up, to do a great work that was necessary in the movement of truth forward. And today, unfortunately, people, including our own president, really just are more interested in what the people think of them and having their face everywhere. And it really is one of the things I think that's caused a lot of the problems, because now it's what's politically expedient, not what is right. The second thing, and no great thing, you probably say, duh, anybody could have guessed that, greed. In case you can't read the bottom of that, it says greed because he who dies with the most stuff wins. And that's been kind of the situation we've been in for the last decade. This was undoubtedly a decade of greed. People had a great faith in the markets, combined with deregulation of the markets to take off all the restrictions, made an absolute house of cards. I worked in the market for over 40 years, and it really is amazing the changes that people had to believe that nothing could be more important than that. And I think it's changed a lot. That was one of the reasons why we just had a situation that was unworkable. We had people being hired with PhDs in mathematics sitting around on Wall Street trying to dream up ways to totally remove all the risk from any investment. And things like the housing bubble that fueled by cheap money and these derivatives really were a product of that. It was the way people said, hey, we can take away anything, we'll all make money, everybody's ahead. But unfortunately, it didn't come out that way. And I think that was a really driving factor. It was unfortunate that it was looked at as a right rather than a privilege. Now, see if you can guess this one. Prisoner number 61727-054 orchestrated the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. That was our friend Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff put together the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. Think about that. 25 years he duped his friends into giving him money, and never did anything with it except bought yachts and paid off the past investors with new investors. So yes, he made off with their money. That's exactly right. So again, a decade of greed, the second problem we had. The third issue, I think, in what went wrong was self-interest. As we think about our own areas and our own fellowship, we put others above ourselves. Unfortunately, the rest of the world doesn't do that. Self-interest of the world really created a big problem. Think about the auto industry, and my heart's out to friends who worked in the auto industry. We have a lot of brethren in Detroit and elsewhere that worked in the auto industry, did their best job, but unfortunately the self-interest of both the management group and the labor, years and years of union labor, really conspiring to please themselves, to get the biggest salaries, to rake in pensions that were just unconscionable, and rather than the customer, and helped by politicians doing that, created a lot of issues. And today, unfortunately, this industry that really began here is just now in its final stages and is really migrated elsewhere. The next thing, deferral of responsibility. I guess we all think about procrastination and about putting things off, and people that don't go to the doctor, don't go to the dentist, eventually catch up and they have to pay the piper. And I think that's actually what's happened with us. I don't know how many of you have walked down the streets of New York, but if you walk down, you can see there's two places in New York where there's a big clock that has our national debt. And it just, those numbers keep spinning, keep spinning. This was one from December 4th. That was $10.1 trillion, our national debt. But it is an example of putting off today what you can, why worry about it and let the next century take care of it. I think one of the big things that's happened to us in this decade and in this last recession is now our creditors, those who were so willing to buy the foreign debt because the U.S. was the safest investment anywhere in the world, are going to ask for more next time. They're going to demand higher cost, higher interest payments for that, and they're going to want us to be constrained. When the end of World War II came and the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed that said the United States would take the fiscal responsibility of guarding the world against a lot of problems with their balance of payments and with their foreign currency, that went away during the Nixon administration, and now we're seeing 30 years later that we're paying for that because we are now being constrained by our foreign creditors about the amount of debt that they are willing for us to take because it impacts all of them. And a hidden thing, which is something that would actually almost double our national debt, is that we have an aging population. Now, I hate to point to myself in that, but it's true. I'm 62 years old. My generation starts drawing Social Security at 66, and over the next decade, you're going to have a tremendous amount of pressure put on the United States when it comes to making those payments, those entitlement programs. And think about the dissatisfaction people will have when or if the Social Security and other entitlement programs are cut back severely. But unless there's, again, one of these cases where we've deferred the responsibility of this, and if you were a business that had $10 trillion worth of debt on the books of your company and you had another $10 trillion off, you would technically be bankrupt. Unfortunately, that's kind of the situation we are in, and it's not just here. You look at Japan, you look at Germany, you look all over the world, Russia, major problems with an aging population. So the deferral of responsibility, this healthcare program, is one example of what's going on as a result of that. So if we were to summarize the decade, I would say it is a dangerous world after all. Those of you who've been to Disneyland or Disney World remember the ride. It's a small world, and that song, well, it's a dangerous world. We started this decade, or soon after this decade, with the signal event of that decade, which was the attack on the World Trade Center. All of us were touched by that. I lost some very close friends in that attack. But it did really redefine the world at the time. The world just hasn't been the same. This decade hasn't been the same. People couldn't wait for it to be over, thinking it's got to be better in the next one. Maybe it will, but it's really redefined global politics, and those problems, as I showed you, that were there at the beginning are still there. We began a war in Afghanistan that continues, and it's become worse than ever. So the world is still a very difficult place. And it only takes once for there to be a next time. There's a picture of the person that was on board that Detroit Northwest airliner that tried to blow up the plane on Christmas Day. And here we are, we spent billions of dollars, $8 billion over the last decade on security to try to prevent this. And guess what? Someone got on and they had easy access, and it hasn't done any good. So here we are again spending all this money. We're in a situation where there could indeed be a next time. So people aren't reassured when it comes to their own security. Let's look at a few of the other imminent dangers that are out there today. First of all, I mentioned the instability of Pakistan. Pakistan has a significant nuclear arsenal. probably one of the most advanced, and it's gotten really very little attention, but they've used it. We know that they used it in their war from Pakistan, and about a decade ago, and they're not afraid to do that. Think about what would happen if a rogue nation like Pakistan decides we're going to be a big player in here and we're going to show this. Secondly, Iran. Iran has this relentless sort of mentality to keep moving forward on building nuclear weapons. This map that shows here are places where they know there are nuclear reactors. And one of the things Iran learned from the Palestinians is to hide these things in caves. And just as those, they were transporting things in through Israel, from Egypt to Israel under these tunnels, Iran has hidden these in tunnels throughout so that they can't be detected. So again, nuclear weaponry is a big issue. I do not think personally that there will ever be a nuclear war that destroys the earth, because the scripture says the earth abides forever. But I think God could very well allow them to go to the point where mass destruction could be a fear that comes over everyone, similar to what we had back in the 50s with the atomic bomb. In North Korea has a number of nuclear weapons as well. So here you have three big areas where we have a real challenging situation, people threatening to blow themselves. And remember, these are people that have no qualms about taking themselves out with the rest of the world. To them, they're doing a religious service. So it is a danger that's out there today. And we haven't talked at all about biological weapons. But, biological weapons are one of the most significant ones. The Germans used them in World War II. We had the Japanese trying to use them in World War II. But biological weapons, I think, at some point could very well make their way into the terrorist use in a much more broad scale. It's a sobering thing to think about, but it is certainly a danger that's out there that we haven't really thought about significantly. I want to talk about Stein's law. I'm talking about Herbert Stein. Now, you may not even know who Herbert Stein is, but a lot of you probably recognize Ben Stein, who is a well-known comedian. He's also an economist, and some people laugh when they see his pieces in the Wall Street Journal. But his father, Herbert, was one of the best economists around, and he coined one of my favorite significant laws. And that law says, things that can't go on forever don't. Now, you have to love economists because they love to state the obvious and call it a law. But it is true. There are always days of reckoning, as I mentioned before. You can't put things off forever. At some point, they have to be dealt with. And so the point of this is, anytime you go long without addressing problems, they ultimately have to be confronted. Now, those of you that are in school, think about that. Because if you put off studying and studying for those exams, at some point you do have to confront those exams. So do your homework, do your studying, and you won't fall subject to Stein's law, the fact that you can't go forever without studying. But it means that you can't avoid or procrastinate. It just makes it more difficult to accomplish. And if you think about that, if you do a little bit every day, you don't have to do a lot on one day. And that's really what we're talking about here. We've put off a number of issues around the world, globally, nationally, and at some point it just makes it so much more difficult, if not impossible, to accomplish. And I really think this is one of the keys to understanding how the Lord brings this social order of things to an end, because at some point there's just too much to deal with, and the world will indeed see no way out because things have caught up. Let's look at some of the problems that have been unaddressed. We talked about the things that were being addressed or worried about. Think about the things unaddressed. Poverty. 80% of humanity today lives on less than $10 a day. Over 80% of the world's population lives in countries with not a narrowing income disparity, but a greater income disparity between the rich and the poor. Now, here's an interesting fact. If you look at the poorest 40% of the world's population, That's 5% of all of income, if you take all the income in the globe. If you look at the 20% of the people, the richest 20%, that's 75% of global income. So, as I say, it's not just in some countries, but around the world, we're seeing a greater disparity between the rich and the poor. And at some point, again, as we talked about last time, the masses become very unhappy and rise up, and that's, I think, certainly a cause for despair with many people. UNICEF, United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, said 25,000 children every day die due to poverty. And notice this, they die quietly in some of the poorest villages on earth, far removed from the scrutiny and conscience of the world. Being meek and weak in life makes these dying multitudes even more invisible in death. And that's an important thing as we think about our own ministry. Who cries for these people? Who cries for these children that are dying? We spend billions and billions on war and defense and everything else, but who's crying for these children that are dying? It's not a matter of getting the money there, it's a matter of turning the hearts of the people that are preventing this. That's a big work that we've got to accomplish in the kingdom, because even if we were to give the money there, there's no tell that it would go to preventing these. But it's a sad thing, and we should all be mindful that these are the reasons why we need the kingdom. And we speak of obesity in our country, but yet over 27% of the population in developing countries are underweight or stunted in growth. The two biggest regions that we have for that, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Let's look at another issue, illiteracy. Now, you think in our day this should be eradicated, but yet as we look at the 21st century, 2000, the beginning of this decade, nearly 1 billion people entered the 21st century not able to read a book or sign their names. Now think about a population of close to 7 billion. 1/7 of the world's population cannot read a book, cannot sign. Even though we've made great progress in developed countries that you see in this chart on the left, in places like South Asia, even in some of the richest oil states, people still cannot read or write. Infectious diseases, another huge problem. 40 million people in the world are living with AIDS. 3 million deaths every year. So here we've had this around a long time. HIV and AIDS. As you can see on the map, a large portion of that again is Asia and Africa. But again, a huge problem that has not, by and large, been eradicated by all the world's efforts. Malaria. Africa is a huge area where we have deaths due to malaria. It accounts for over 90% of the deaths. Every year, 350 to 500 million cases of malaria. 1 million people die each day from mosquito bites, or each year from mosquito bites. It's a sad thing in our days. Lack of water and sanitation. Here's one that we take so much for granted. The fact that we can turn on a faucet and get clean water, yet over 1 billion people in developing countries don't have access to clean water. Another 2.6 billion don't even have the basic sanitation. We get upset when we look at a house and we don't have a bathroom for every bedroom. But think about almost 3 billion people that don't even have the basic sanitation. Access to piped water. It's a great luxury to have water coming right into your house. 85% of the people in the wealthiest 20% of the population have that. But if you go to poorer countries, 25% have it. A big, huge difference. Over almost 2 million children die each year from diarrhea. That's really a sad case, isn't it? And over 50% of the people in developing countries suffer from problems not caused by disease, but caused by just the lack of clean water and adequate sanitation. Well, let's shift to another major problem, I think, and that's the lack of faith in Christian countries. Here's a map that may be a little tough to read, but it shows you how the world is spread out in terms of religion. And I want to look at a couple of surveys that were done by the Pew Forum. The Pew Forum is probably the leading researcher on things around religion and public life, the high integrity of the research, and they've been doing this for a long time. It shows you the sad state we have of religion in not just our country but around the world, but it does indicate, as we said before, that we're seeing a significant change in the religious world. This fact that 20% of the people believe that there is spiritual energy in mountains and trees. Now, we appreciate God's creation, and we appreciate the fact that He's given us this glory and beauty. But here's 1/5 of the population that believes that there's actually spiritual energy here. 20% of Catholics today believe in reincarnation. In the Eastern faiths, New Age beliefs, 65% of adults in the U.S. who claim to be either Protestant or Catholic now say that it's okay to incorporate Eastern faiths, New Age beliefs. All have been integrated. Now, Brother Russell's day, this was called spiritualism, not spiritism, but spiritualism. In the days of the early church, if you read back in the New Testament, this was called syncretism. In other words, bringing a lot of different faiths together and mixing them all up. And that's really what happened to early Christianity. It's why we ended up believing in the Trinity, why we got the doctrine of the immortal soul, even the Holy Spirit. It's because they started bringing all these beliefs in from different places. So I expect religion to even get more confounding and really more confusing for people. I think this is perhaps the most significant. 70% of the people that said they were religious said all kinds of religions can lead to eternal life, and questioning authority. Experience is more important than authority in religion. Remember, at one time, this world was controlled by the religious authorities, and people did everything to please those religious authorities. Today, those authorities don't mean anything to people. On the other hand, we have in many countries a repression of faith. The developed countries that we know, places like India, India suppresses the Christian faith. We know there's a lot of difficulties there. Kashmiri, the Pandits, we have persecution for a great many of those years. And everywhere we find Jews being persecuted in developed countries. So it really, the face of religion is changing constantly. Now, Pew Research did another research study on global restrictions of religion, from the least free to the most free. And here's the results. 1/3 of all the countries that restrict people from practicing religion because of government policies and laws. Think about that. 1/3 of the world restricts people from practicing freedom of religion. 70% of the population of the world lives in some of those most restrictive countries. Now you know that China is actually one of the big ones. 90% of the countries require religious groups to register. And if you look at 3 out of the 5, that results in some kind of discrimination. If we look globally, only 25% of the countries that exist today have any kind of language in their constitution protecting the religious freedom of people. So, while in our country, all kind of religion is possible and actually happens, in most countries, we're finding great restrictions on religion. So what is the current situation? Let's summarize. If we look at Luke 21:25, it says, "There shall be signs upon the earth, distress of nations with perplexity." That word perplexity means to be no way out, to be at a loss. And it was pointed out to me recently that word that's translated perplexity also means a unified perplexity. It doesn't mean individual perplexity. It means to be together and find no way out. So think about that. The nations today have looked for ways to solve the issues. Things like the United Nations, things like World Health Organizations, all these things that are the nations coming together to try to resolve a problem, yet they haven't been able to do it. And I think this is one of the early signs we have that the earth is coming into a distress. People are seeing, how do we solve these problems? And the world is at a loss to do it. I think Jesus summed it up good in Matthew 9:16 when he said, "No man putteth a piece of new cloth into an old garment, for that which is put in to fill it up taketh from the garment, and the rent is made worse." To this point, we've just been patching up the old world. I talked about deferred responsibility. People have been putting things off. We do this, we can let the next generation worry about it. And as I mentioned, Stein's law says at some point these things catch up to you and you have to deal with them. And I think that's where we are in the world today, that we're finding many problems that just keep being put off, not being dealt with. If we look at the systems of government over the long term, now I talked about the last decade, but let's talk about the last 1,000 years. Every form of government has been unable to secure some kind of permanent peace and security. Monarchies, that's the rule of kings. We often say that monarchies were destroyed at the end of World War I, 1914, but not entirely true. We still have 44 nations today that are monarchies, but they haven't resolved anything. Oligarchies, that's the rule of the few. Now, the example of that is like South Africa. South Africa under apartheid was the rule of a few, and that's the people that had, their own special interest in mind. The aristocracies, prior to the French Revolution, we had 16th century England and France, where it was the rule of the wealthy and the few and the rich. That didn't work. It resulted in the overthrow and the revolt of the people. Dictatorships. Think about places like Germany, China, Zimbabwe, places where one man or one person dictates all the rules. We found very few instances where there was any kind of a benevolent dictator. I think that's really what the world will see when we see the reign of Jesus. Socialism. Africa, Asia, Latin America, those countries that are some of the poorest today had great efforts at socialism, and the fact that they couldn't do it by dividing the goods and services, we just found more and more poor people and less disparity, less opportunity for people. Communism, of course, Russia, Poland, Hungary, all those, especially before 1989, had people that tried to rule as communistic, where the government owned the goods and distributed it to everyone else. Didn't work. Today we see democracy, 123 countries today around the world, and this is today's solution. I think we're just working through all these things and finding out that none of them offers a permanent peace and prosperity. Yes, democracy is good. It's the most free system we have, and we should be grateful for it. But yet it can't address all the problems that exist. It hasn't adequately addressed hunger. It hasn't adequately addressed all these problems that we've talked about. And certainly anarchy. Now, anarchy in its truest form just means no government, the rule of the people. You see what's happened in Afghanistan, even though they're electing officials there and electing a president, by and large it's anarchy. Afghanistan is really every man for himself. And I just wonder, when it comes down to it, whether people, if they're in a true anarchistic situation, any government is better than no government at all. And I think it gives an opportunity prior to the kingdom being established that we could indeed see this situation, because every government has failed. So as we look at today's situation, the organizations, the social systems, the religions, the economic structures, everything we talked about in these last two sessions, they have to be replaced. Why? Because it has to benefit all people. Daniel 5:27 says, "Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting." The final battle, I think, of Armageddon, that dissolves powers not for the purpose of just destroying the world, but it's the purpose of answering all these things. And I think that's an important thing as we look at that. They've not benefited all people. In every case, it's resulted in not changing men's hearts, which is what we need to do for the benefit of everyone. And remember, Jesus' return has a purpose. It has a purpose and connection with the world. And that purpose is stated in Haggai 2:7. I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations will come. I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. I think one of the things God is doing right now is letting the nations shake themselves. He's preparing them for the kingdom by letting them try every means possible, and they're just having an opportunity to try to make things work. And so far, as we said, we've gone through every system of government, and nothing has worked. So I think God is letting man play it out. One of the things I appreciated, a friend said to me that if the kingdom had been fully established in 1914, we would have seen the people griping, saying, well, you didn't give us enough time, Lord. We could have done this if you'd had it on our own. And I think that God has got to give man the opportunity to go as far as he can before he does that. Under divine standard, everyone on earth is going to enjoy peace, is going to enjoy equality, an opportunity for life. That's really what is meant to be. And so that's, I think, what we look forward to as we go forward. The Psalm 22:27 is the last scripture I'm going to use. It says, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. That's important for us to understand. God is in control. This is not to be a world that ends in disaster. It's a world that will bring blessings, things, and all the things I've talked about today in the last session shouldn't be looked upon with disdain. And I know a lot of you are younger and wonder, what does it mean for me? But if things in our lifetime transgress and change, it's going to be more glorious than you would ever hope for. God won't leave anyone sad. So let's think about that as we go forward, that it's a time we should be rejoicing and understanding that, yes, the things we look for are going to happen. God is going to resolve this issue, bring man far more blessings than he could have ever had elsewhere.